Hi, Chris Blake Turner. Thank you so much for joining us. You're a philosophy professor at the Oklahoma State University. Thanks so much
That's
for
right.
your time.
Yeah, no, it's a pleasure to be here, Sahar. Thanks.
So I read your paper. The link will be in the video description. It's called Fake News, Relevant Alternatives, and the Degradation of Our Epistemic Environment.
Nice succinct title.
Yeah, for sure. And looking at this whole paper, it fits under the umbrella of social epistemology. But what is that? Like, where in philosophy are we? What is the part of social epistemology that makes this important?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a story about epistemology that's useful, if maybe not entirely true, that traditionally it was very much concerned with individuals, thinking about stuff on their own. So think of, Rodin's thinker contemplating stuff and, gaining knowledge or not, that kind of way. And epistemology was, traditionally conceived, at least the story goes, as about individuals trying to know things or understand things or find things out. And then more recently, particularly, let's say the last 30 years, 20 years, people have been much more interested in how the fact that we are social creatures that live in communities and societies impacts what it is that we can and can't know or justifiably believe or understand. And so that kind of effort to understand how our sort of social context influences how we get to know things or not, we can think of that as social epistemology. And this paper fits into a particular part of that we might think of as social epistemology of the internet or something like that. The internet is a super social place for most of us. We're on social media, we're interacting with other people. You and I right now are having this conversation because of the internet. And that, gives us all kinds of opportunities to get to know cool stuff, but also raises certain kinds of challenges. And that's the kind of debate that this paper is engaging with.
And the challenge you're engaging with is called fake news, right?
Right.
So, what is news? What is fake news?
Yeah, it's actually much harder to give nice, crisp definitions of those things than you'd think. So, I in the paper I sort of fudge this by saying, whatever definition of fake news you want will work, and I think that's true. But we should at least say a little something. So, we can think of news as attempting to report, some kind of factual information. We can distinguish that from like punditry, where, that might happen on a network that's branded as like a news network or by someone who's on a news website or a blogger or something. But, punditry is more maybe educated and informed opinion, but something like that. Let's think of news maybe a bit artificially, but hopefully usefully as really narrowly like people trying to give factual information. And there's some kind of sense in if you're just shouting things out on the street corner, you're not purveying news. In order to produce news, you have to be part of some kind of journalistic institution or practice or something like that, which is going to involve standards of, journalistic integrity, checking sources, things like that. So maybe news is something like that, and then fake news is maybe even trickier to get into. We can do that if you want.
No, I already have a question. So,
Great.
based on what you're saying, news is or should be, if I get on X and post something, that doesn't necessarily count as news, does it?
It doesn't, but, and this is exactly part of what I want to get into in this paper, is that our kinds of, let's say, sort of call them like rules of engagement for, how we assess sources or claims, they've evolved, like not necessarily on an evolutionary timescale, but just in terms of our social practices, very much without the internet. The internet is a super modern phenomenon in our lives. And so we're pretty good, I think, at when we're out and about, working out whether someone is trying to give us like, some sort of news story or not. We see like newspapers or whatever, or, we know what news anchors on TV look like. And people can exploit that in ways we might talk about later. But online, it's much harder. But I think we should think of news as something a bit more than people just like saying something, just asserting something or testifying. So even if you say, you get on X and you say, so and so won the presidential primary or whatever, but you don't give me any kind of like source or anything like that. Maybe let's think of that as not news and you're just like saying something, testifying, asserting something. Let's think of news as maybe a bit more tied to some kind of media structure or something like that, just to keep things on the simpler side, because people like just saying stuff is an important source of information, but that's even harder to think through in some ways.
Sure, good answer. Okay, I'm with you completely. So your paper deals with primarily the epistemic problem with fake news.
That's right.
What does that mean? Like, what are you dealing with? What's the epistemic problem with fake news?
Yeah, that's a lovely question, and we philosophers love to, talk about epistemic X's and Y's as if that, obviously makes sense. It's actually kind of hard to say what that means sometimes. So, I mean, here's one. I think do the best way I can answer this question is to contrast it. So
Okay.
it's not a moral problem. Maybe there's a moral problem with fake news of like it's morally wrong to, spread fake news or something like that. Maybe that's true, but that's not what I'm interested in this project. And it's also not just like a psychological problem. Like maybe it just like makes people upset if you spread fake news or it's bad for you or something like that. It's also not that. So the idea of it being an epistemic problem is supposed to be something to do with what it has to say or the influence it has on us having beliefs that are rationally formed and held and ideally count as knowledge. We want to know stuff. We don't just want to have like good beliefs about things, although those are nice. We actually want to know that such and such is the case. And so the epistemic problem of fake news has to do with like, what problems does fake news cause for us getting to know stuff?
So is the problem that fake news makes people think that they know, but they don't? Or is the problem that it threatens actual knowledge? Or is the problem that it would be very unclear whether people actually knew what they thought they knew? Like the connection between this fake news causing a break in the sort of like information in knowledge acquired chain. Like what exactly is going wrong here?
Yeah, good. I mean, the short answer is lots of stuff.
Oh, okay.
And so there's a whole like sort of recent literature on what exactly is going wrong with fake news. And
Okay.
it touches on basically all of the things that you said. So
Oh.
sometimes maybe it does involve like, oh, I think I've got this like well-sourced piece of information, but actually it's fake news. Maybe the person who spread it knows that or not. I think it's still, something counts as fake news even if you innocently kind of spread it around. Um, that's a problem. It's a real problem. I'm kind of interested in maybe slightly subtler, but I think maybe for that reason, kind of more pernicious, because maybe less obvious problems with fake news in this paper.
Okay, what's
So
that?
yeah, so there are kind of two. One is thinking about kind of like an individual's interaction with a piece of information and what happens when you encounter a piece of information, a piece of fake news. And that problem, in a nutshell, is the second thing that you said. It makes it harder to get to know things. Um, so I'm going to use a piece of jargon here that I think is helpful. So I'm drawing on this kind of literature and epistemology called the relevant alternatives framework for understanding what knowledge is. So the idea is pretty simple. The idea is roughly something like you only get to know something if you can rule out all the relevant alternatives to that thing. So, suppose there are three relevant alternatives. The butler did it, the maid did it, or I don't know, the valet did it. Those are the only three relevant alternatives. If I can rule out that the maid did it and I can rule out that the butler did it, then I know that the valet did it. And also, like, if I come up and say to you, well, the butler did it, and you say, wait, are you sure that can you rule out that the maid did it? And I say, well, no, it seems like I don't actually know that the butler did it. So the idea then is that part of what it is to know something, or maybe that's too strong, but at least like knowledge kind of goes hand in hand with this ability to like rule out competing alternatives to the thing you're supposed to know. And the problem with fake news then, or one of the problems that I highlight in this paper, is that even if you don't believe the piece of fake news, you might not be in a position to rule it out because there's like a gap between being able to like disbelieve something and being able to rule something out. So Sorry, being able to, there's a gap between not believing something and being able to rule it out. So here's an example. I don't believe that the number of stars in the galaxy is even, but I can't rule out that it's even, and I can't rule out that it's odd. I like need more evidence to rule one of those things out than it just not to be reasonable to not believe it. And so the problem here is then I mean, you get problems if people believe fake news, but I'm trying to suggest that there's a problem even if you don't believe it. If you don't believe it, but you don't have enough evidence to rule that thing out, then it might stop you from knowing things that you would otherwise know.
So we're halfway through your title. Fake
Yes.
news, relevant alternatives, and now let's go to the degradation of our epistemic environment.
Right.
So whether you believe it or not, having fake news spread into our world with real news degrades our epistemic environment. What does that mean?
Yeah, so I think one way of thinking about this is to go back to the kind of what is social epistemology thing that we were thinking
Okay.
about at the beginning. And I see this paper as being part of a really recent, though I hope because it's part of this tradition, to kind of make social epistemology even more social. So when I sort of told you that little story about the history of epistemology at the beginning, we had like individuals, and then we kind of had groups of individuals, but they're still kind of individuals. It's just that they're talking to each other or reading each other's stuff or something. I want to think about how our whole environment matters when we're doing epistemology. So, I and a couple of other people have independently very recently come up with a similar notion, come up in the paper with this notion of an epistemic environment. And that's kind of all the stuff, not just in our heads, which is where philosophers tend to think about things like, how good at reasoning are you, or how good is your like perception working or something like that. That's all relevant, but I want to think about all the external stuff that makes a difference to whether you get to know things or not. So think about like what kind of experts you have in your epistemic environment. Like, do you have nuclear physicists in your community? If not, I mean, community broadly construed, like maybe you can read about their testimony from someone else. But if not, it's going to be hard for you to know stuff about like microphysics or whatever it is, or nuclear physics or whatever it is. Think about what tools you have available. If you don't have microscopes available, like either to you or to like some relevant people in your community, you're not going to be able to know very many things about bacteria. So I want to think about this broader notion of like how we relate to our environment, kind of, and I don't stress this in the paper, but kind of an analogy to certain ways that environmental ethicists think about how we should relate to our environment in terms of thinking about what we should do. What we should do, you might think, is not just about like how do we relate to other people, kind of how do we relate to our environment as a whole. And that's kind of what I'm trying to do here on the epistemological front as well. So that's the epistemic environment. And then the idea is that fake news degrades it, makes it worse in a couple of different ways.
So something like there are things in the environment that will stop me from getting to the truth, given that there's fake news.
Or at least they make it harder. So I
Mm.
think of them as like epistemic pollutants. Pollutants don't necessarily kill you or whatever, but they make things worse off. They increase the risk of bad stuff happening. And I think of fake news as like an epistemic pollutant. So the more it's spread around, the more of these alternatives there are that you need to be able to rule out in order to know stuff. And so the harder it is to know stuff. There might also be knock-on effects, like if I start to realize that there's a lot of fake news in my environment, I might reasonably, and this is kind of tricky because we often like to think that, if we act reasonably, everything's going to go well. But I think we might reasonably conclude, oh, I shouldn't trust like most of the things that I read or something like that. And that's like a tricky position to be in epistemically because it seems like you're acting pretty reasonably or rationally, and yet it also seems like you should be discounting most of the information you get. But as social creatures, we have to rely on each other all the time for most of our information. It might also break down our confidence in like various kinds of institutions. Like maybe we start to think that like the news media is just corrupt or something like that because we start to be able to lose our distinction between sort of genuine news and fake news. So there's all these places where the fake news kind of pollutes our epistemic environment and makes it harder for us to achieve those epistemic goods that we want, like knowledge or understanding or whatever else it is that we care about.
You end the paper like you're talking now, almost not optimistically. Are you on X?
I actually haven't been on there for a long time,
Are
partly
you
because
on
I think it's
Facebook?
like become a bad epistemic environment. Like I find X pretty hard to get useful information out of these days.
Are you on Facebook?
Yes.
Are you on Instagram?
No, I pretty much try not to be on social media very much these days.
Social media,
Yeah.
like the platforms where everyone's just selling ideas as if true. So, so help me understand this. You're on some social media, but not all social media. And the more fake news there are being posted every day, the worse the environment is for someone seeking truth. You have a PhD in philosophy. You're seeking truth. So, like, what are we supposed to do if we want to be social creatures? And this is how today we interact with others is on social media, but it's filled with false information or fake news. So we shouldn't trust what we read, but we should be reading. I mean, it's very dizzying. What is your solution that's working in your life for this epistemic problem of fake news?
So here's what I try to do, although I'm not confident that it's the right thing to do, and I certainly don't always succeed in doing this. But here's what I
Okay.
try to do is I try not to get most of my news from social media. Um, or at least I try not to get it uncorroborated from social media. So if I see something that looks like a news story, and particularly it's not a kind of source or outlet that I recognize and trust, and I'll come back to that in a second, I'll try and corroborate it some way that I do trust before sharing it with anyone. Um,
Can I push
so
back on that
please.
attempt? Say you're in a really epistemically unlucky social environment. You've got, if you're a conservative, pretend liberal, or if you're a liberal, pretend conservative, or just go to the other side of the tracks and say,
Mhm.
like, you're stuck over there with those people who are wrong and don't know what evidence is, whichever one you think that person is. The ones that you trust as credible sources would be wrong, but that's who you think is credible. The media outlets that you do trust, since you don't trust your friends, would be wrong if that's the environment you grew up in. And we don't know, like, what color is the right color or what news channel is the uncorrupt one. And we're all in these echo chambers. So, what does that even mean for someone who's seeking truth and then saying, well, I won't trust social media, I'll go to the good media sources? But if we don't know which ones those are, somebody's got the fake news. How do you know if it's you?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I don't have an optimistic answer to that question. I mean, the problem there's a real problem here with like a chicken and egg, or like not a chicken, like a catch 22.
Okay,
Like if
explain it.
you're in a really bad epistemic environment, it's really hard to get out of it, I think, for precisely the kinds of reasons you're talking about. Like if you trust the wrong people and distrust the wrong people as in they're telling you, they're not actually getting at the truth, or their, methods are bad, and you distrust the people who, have good, reliable, practices of trying to gain, factual information. That's a really hard place to get out of for exactly the kinds of reasons
Right?
that you're saying. Some philosophers have said much more interesting things than I have to say about this, so I'd just be sort of parenting work by, say, like T. Nguyen on this. But I think so. I encourage like people to go look up T. Nguyen's work on echo chambers and epistemic bubbles. He's got some really interesting stuff on this. But maybe one lesson to take away is that it's important to trust sort of you have to trust some sources or others. You can't just like be a blank slate all the time. That would be way too much work. Like I can't go and vet every source I see. I have to like read something and see, oh, it's from this newspaper, and I trust that enough that I'm going to take. I can't go and do my own research like all the time. There's no
Right?
time in the day for that. But maybe we shouldn't trust any particular source too much. So, if some source is saying something and that's getting heavily like disconfirmed by a bunch of other avenues that we get information from, maybe we should be willing to like downgrade our credibility in that first source. Because what we want to avoid getting into is a kind of trap where we trust kind of one source so much that we'll just listen to anything they say, even if other sources are disagreeing with them. But it's it's hard to extricate ourselves from those kinds of situations.
Thanks for clearing that up and for citing your sources for the idea. So you already mentioned one thing that you think you should have put in this paper from that was published a few years ago but didn't. Is there anything else that you wish you put into this paper?
Yeah, so I think a lot of these sort of problems about fake news are just going to be much, much worse with things like deep fakes and like AI generated stuff. I mean, just in terms of text and fake news stories, like text stories, AI is just already starting to proliferate the amount of fake news that there is. So that's just like increasing, the amount of pollution in the epistemic environment. But we might worry that like some kinds of things are going to be even worse like this. So another really good social epistemologist, Regina Rini, has just started writing some stuff about how, deep fakes, video deep fakes, if they're good enough, might kind of undermine our confidence in video evidence completely. And in sort of my terminology, the worry would be that if deepfakes get good enough and there's enough of them in the epistemic environment, the environment's going to become one where we can't trust video sources at all. And that's a serious impediment to our gaining knowledge. Like video evidence is great, typically. It's a really reliable, it's not, it's not a, what's the word for completely, look, it's not like completely certain, it's not indefeasible is the word I'm looking for,
Sure,
but it's a
yeah.
really good source that we have, and especially for adjudicating between some of these other issues, when someone says, this thing happened, and someone says, no, the other thing happened, sometimes the way to solve that is precisely with a piece of
A
video,
video.
picture, right? And so if we start to get into an epistemic environment where we can't like trust our eyes, we can't trust our pictures and videos, that's going to be really tricky. I don't know what to do about that. Partly, presumably, it's going to take like institutional kinds of solutions, like social media platforms maybe need to buy into certain kinds of things. But one thing that I talk a bit about in the paper too is I think we need to hold each other more responsible too, and like hold up our hands too if we share fake news or something like that. I'm speaking now to the people who do it unwillingly, like unwittingly, people who don't
Mm.
know that they've shared something that's a deep fake or a textual piece of fake news. Um, I think it can be easy to kind of maybe you feel a bit sheepish or embarrassed about that or something, and you kind of like just want to pretend it didn't happen. But I think it's important to own up to those things and to point them out and to kind of call each other out if we see each other doing that, like gently and kindly, because I think a lot of the time fake news is spread unwittingly. Like presumably, it starts off by someone. I mean, this is goes back to what we think fake news is, but I like to think of it as starting with someone trying to be deceptive, but once that deceptive thing is out there, people could, in good faith, take it up and share it around. And it's kind of tough to call each other out for things that we do in good faith. But I think we might need to do that as well because criticizing each other, albeit I hope kindly, is a really important way of kind of shifting our social norms and how we think about and relate to our epistemic environment, which I think is what it's going to take. Like one sort of slogan for this whole project is we're in a kind of new frontier in our epistemic environment and we're going to need new rules to deal with that.
Wonderful. Any final words before we end here today on this paper?
I think this is a really cool topic. It's something I'm passionate about because it does a thing that I really love in philosophy where you get some kind of like theoretical kind of arcane stuff. Like in this paper, the relevant alternatives framework comes from just like thinking about traditional hardcore external world skepticism, brains and vats, Cartesian demons. And you can sometimes look at that and think, what has this got to do with anything? Like it's fun to think through or whatever. But sometimes, and I think this is a good example, those kinds of theoretical tools that we've developed can actually bear like really important fruit in highly like timely, urgent, even practical situations. So yeah, this is a topic that I really like, partly because of the content, but partly because of this like methodological thing that it shows of like you never know where those insights are going to come from.
Chris Blake Turner, thank you so much.
Thank you.